My name is Leo, and ever since I was a little kid, I've been hooked on old things. Not just old toys or old cars, though those are cool too. I mean really old things, like cracked maps with forgotten towns, dusty journals filled with faded ink, and especially, the hushed whispers of stories that seem to hang in the air around ancient places. My grandpa, he says I've got a detective's mind, always looking for clues in the past. He's the one who first told me about Eldoria, a name that even now, when I say it out loud, makes my spine tingle a little bit. It was a village that just went quiet. Not in a day, not in a week, but slowly, like a song fading out, until there was nothing left but the silence. The official story, the one you might find in a dusty local history book, says it happened sometime in the early 1920s. Think about that. The Great War had just ended a few years before, and the world was trying to find its feet again. Cars were still a fancy new thing, and radios were just starting to hum into people's homes. But out where Eldoria was, tucked deep in a valley that stretched like a forgotten arm of the mountains, none of that modern stuff really mattered. Eldoria was a place lost in time even before it was lost to history. I've spent countless hours in my grandpa's study, poring over old ledgers and faded photographs, trying to piece together a picture of what life was like there. The air in his study smells of old paper and leather, and I swear sometimes I can almost smell the wood smoke and damp earth of Eldoria itself, rising from the pages. Eldoria was a tiny, self-contained universe. The valley itself was shaped like a huge, worn-out teacup, and Eldoria sat right at the bottom. A single, winding river, the Eldon, snaked through the valley, providing water for the fields and turning the great, creaking wheel of the mill. The village itself was a tight cluster of about 50 stone cottages, built from the slate and granite of the surrounding mountains. Their roofs were thick with moss, a soft green blanket that kept out the cold and rain. The houses huddled together as if for warmth, their little windows like watchful eyes facing the central square. At the heart of the square, a gnarled, ancient oak tree stood sentinel. Its roots looked like giant, grasping fingers pushing up from the earth, and its branches were so thick and heavy they cast a perpetual shadow over the old water pump and the few wooden benches where the villagers would sit and talk. A typical day in Eldoria, say, in the spring of 1922, was a symphony of simple, everyday sounds. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer from old Mr. Theron's forge. He was a wiry man with arms like rope, and his hammer was the heartbeat of the village, a steady, rhythmic clang. Clang. Clang that could be heard all the way up to the highest pastures. The lowing of Farmer Fitzwilliam's cattle as they were led out to graze. Fitzwilliam was a stoic man, but his love for his herd was known to everyone. He'd talk to his cows as if they were his children, and they'd respond with soft moos and the gentle swing of their heads. The giggling and shouting of the children, like my friend Thomas and his little sister Mary, as they played games in the meadow, their voices carrying on the breeze. The gentle hum of Ilara's spinning wheel as she turned fresh wool into yarn, her face serene and focused. The scent of her baking bread would waft from her cottage, a warm, yeasty aroma that made everyone's stomach rumble in anticipation. The entire village was connected by these sounds and smells, a living, breathing thing. The people of Eldoria were a community in the truest sense of the word. They knew each other's joys and sorrows. When a child was born, everyone celebrated with gifts of bread and milk. When someone was sick, neighbors would take turns bringing them soup and sitting by their bedside. If a roof needed mending, a dozen men would show up with tools and strong backs to help. They didn't need fancy things, they had each other. They would gather under the great oak on Sundays after church, sharing news and gossip, their voices a low murmur that blended with the rustling of the leaves. They were a people who believed in hard work, a close family, and the power of their little community to overcome anything. They had weathered harsh winters, floods from the Eldon, and even the distant shadow of the Great War, which had claimed a few of their young men. They were survivors. The first whispers of something being wrong weren't shouts of alarm. They were more like missed connections, like the slow, quiet severing of a lifeline. The postman, a stout fellow named Mr. Finch who traveled the winding mountain roads once a week, noticed it first. Mr. Finch was a creature of habit and a man who prided himself on his reliability. His route was a treacherous one, with steep climbs and narrow passes, but he loved the quiet solitude and the brief, friendly chats at each stop. For years, Eldoria had been a reliable part of his route. Their mail was always waiting for him in a canvas bag by the old stone wall at the entrance to the village. But then, one crisp autumn day in 1923, there was nothing. Just the bag, empty. He thought little of it, maybe a mix-up, or maybe no one had mail to send. But the next week, the same thing. And the week after. Letters to Eldoria, carefully addressed with loops and flourishes, began to pile up in his satchel, but he had nothing to bring back. He started to feel a growing sense of unease, a weight in his stomach that had nothing to do with the bumpy ride. The lively, cheerful voices of the villagers he was used to greeting were replaced by a cold, unsettling silence. Then came the turn of the traveling salesman, a jovial man with a handlebar mustache named Arthur Pendleton, who brought everything from sewing needles to patent medicines to remote communities. Arthur saw himself as a purveyor of not just goods, but of news and a connection to the outside world. Eldoria was usually a good stop for him. Friendly faces, decent sales, and old Mrs. Henderson's apple tarts were a powerful incentive. But when he arrived one sunny afternoon in late summer, expecting the usual warm welcome, he found the road leading into the village eerily empty. No children playing, no smoke from chimneys. The blacksmith's forge was cold, his hammer silent. The mill wheel, usually churning with the river's current, was still, moss already beginning to creep up its wooden blades. Arthur called out, his voice echoing unervingly. He knocked on doors, hesitant at first, then louder. No answer. Not a single bark from a dog, not a single bleat from a sheep. It was as if the village had simply held its breath and forgotten to exhale. The sound of his own footsteps on the cobblestones was deafening. He described the scene later, in a nervous whisper, to the sheriff in the nearest town. The clothesline outside one cottage still held crisp white sheets, fluttering gently in the breeze, as if someone had just hung them out to dry and would be back any minute to retrieve them. A half-eaten loaf of bread sat on a kitchen table in another, the knife resting beside it. A child's wooden hoop lay abandoned in the square, almost as if its owner had simply stepped away for a moment. But no one came back. No one was there. Just the wind, rustling through the empty streets, and the unsettling quiet that had fallen over Eldoria. A quiet that stretched on for days, then weeks, then months, until it became a century-old mystery, a ghost story told in hushed tones, about the village that simply went quiet. And that, for me, was where the real story began. I knew there had to be more to it than just a simple disappearance. A whole village doesn't just vanish into thin air. They left clues behind, and I was going to find them. The traveling salesman, Arthur Pendleton, was a man of his word and a man easily unnerved by the strange. His hurried, breathless account to the local sheriff, a gruff but honest fellow named Silas Thorne, was taken seriously. Sheriff Thorne gathered a small party of men from the nearest town, a mix of deputies and a few sturdy volunteers, and set off for Eldoria the very next morning. They followed the winding dirt road, their horses' hooves kicking up dust and the quiet of the morning broken only by their own nervous chatter. None of them had ever heard of any trouble in Eldoria. It was a place you either lived in or passed by on your way to somewhere else, and they were, for all intents and purposes, outsiders. They were riding into a silence they couldn't possibly have prepared for. When they arrived, the scene was exactly as Pendleton had described, but amplified by the morning light. The air was still, heavy with the scent of pine and something else, something indefinable that hung in the air, the scent of an absence. It was a palpable thing, a presence made of emptiness. Sheriff Thorne, a man who had seen his share of tragedy and strange happenings, later wrote in his official report that the feeling was most unsettling, as if the world itself had held its breath and forgotten to breathe again. The mill wheel was indeed silent, but the river, the Eldon, still rushed past it, mocking its stillness with a constant, gurgling sound. The horses snorted and shifted nervously, sensing something was wrong, something that their human riders could only feel in the back of their minds. The men dismounted and fanned out, their voices hushed, their boots crunching on the gravel of the village square. The sun beat down, warm and cheerful, but its light seemed to illuminate only the emptiness. They found the abandoned child's hoop right where Pendleton had seen it, a single spoke of its wooden frame snapped, as if its owner had dropped it in a moment of surprise. In the blacksmith's forge, the fire was nothing but a pile of cold, white ash, but the tools were laid out neatly on the workbench, as if Mr. Theron had just stepped out for a moment to get a drink of water and would be back to finish his work. The anvil, scarred and worn from years of use, stood cold and silent, no longer the heart of the village. They went house to house, Sheriff Thorne using the butt of his pistol to knock on each door. The hollow echoes of the knocks were the only response. They found no signs of forced entry, no smashed windows, no broken doors. Every lock was either unlatched or undisturbed. Inside, the quiet was even more profound. In one cottage, they found a half-finished meal on the table, a steaming pot of stew cooled to a thick, greasy mass. In another, a woman's shawl was draped over the back of a chair, as if she had just stood up to answer a knock at the door. There were no notes, no signs of a struggle, no bodies. The beds were unmade in some houses, neatly made in others. Everything was in its place, but the people who belonged to it were gone. The sheer mundanity of the scene was what made it so terrifying. It was a photograph of a normal day, but all the living subjects had been expertly cut out of the frame. The most chilling discovery was made in the barn belonging to the Fitzwilliam family. The livestock pens were all empty. The cattle, the sheep, the chickens all gone. Not a single animal was left behind. This was a crucial detail. If the villagers had just run away in a panic, they would not have taken all their livestock. And if some kind of enemy had come, there would have been a struggle, and likely some of the animals would have been left behind. The pens were clean, the troughs were full of water, but there was no life. It was as if someone had come and calmly, methodically, and silently taken all the animals as well as the people. Sheriff Thorne and his men searched every building, every field, and every inch of the surrounding woods. They found nothing. No footprints, no tire tracks that weren't their own, no sign of any large group of people moving through the valley. The forest was dense and the mountain paths were treacherous, but even then, 100 people and their animals would have left some trace. But there was nothing. It was as if Eldoria and all its inhabitants had simply been erased from the face of the earth, leaving behind only their empty shells of a home. News of the vanishing spread like wildfire through the neighboring towns. At first, it was a source of fear and wild speculation. People whispered about a curse, a plague that struck so fast it left no bodies, or even something more sinister and supernatural. The story got so out of hand that a local newspaper from the larger city had to send a reporter, a young man named Elias Vance, to investigate. Vance was a skeptic, a city boy who thought these rural folks were just getting worked up over nothing. But after he spent a day in the valley, walking the empty streets and feeling the profound, heavy silence for himself, his skepticism started to fade. He wrote a famous article about it, titled "The Village of Shadows," where he described the untouched perfection of the village and the terrifying reality that not a single soul was left to disturb it. He pointed out the unmowed fields, the lack of new growth in the gardens, the slowly fading footprints in the dust, all of which showed that no one had been there for a significant amount of time. In the local tavern in the town of Oak Haven, the regulars would sit around and argue about what happened. There was old Hemlock, a grizzled old man with a long beard and a face like a dried apple, who knew the Eldoria folks better than anyone. He swore up and down that the people of Eldoria would never have abandoned their homes. "The Theron family has been blacksmiths in that valley for 200 years, he'd say, his voice raspy. "You don't just up and leave a home like that. Not for all the money in the world. And the Fitzwilliams, why, their great-grandfather planted that ancient oak. Their roots were deeper than that tree's. They didn't just vanish. Something took them. Something unnatural." Hemlock's words would always send a shiver through the patrons, and they'd fall silent, nursing their beers and staring into the fire, imagining what a force powerful enough to uproot a century-old village would look like. There was a theory, a little bit more grounded in reality, that they had all been taken by a mysterious cult or a band of ruthless kidnappers. But this theory had more holes than a piece of Swiss cheese. There was no sign of a struggle, no ransom notes, no broken property. And how would a group of kidnappers, no matter how big or well organized, move 100 people and all their livestock without a single person noticing, without a single sound of a struggle escaping the valley? It was an impossible feat. The kidnappers would have left a trail, and the Eldoria people, though peaceful, were tough. They would have fought. As for the idea that they all just decided to leave, that was even more preposterous. The Eldoria people were proud of their heritage and their land. They had no reason to go, and certainly not all at once, without telling anyone, without leaving a single trace. The half-eaten meals, the half-finished chores, the clothes on the line, all of it pointed to a sudden, instantaneous vanishing. Not a planned exodus. It was a mystery that defied all logic, all reason, and all attempts at a simple explanation. And as the years passed, the wind and rain began to take their toll on the village. The roofs started to sag, the windows began to break, and the village of Eldoria slowly became a ghost town, a silent testament to a century-old vanishing that no one could ever explain. But I knew, deep down, that the story wasn't over. The clues were there, hidden in the silence, just waiting for someone to listen. The official reports and the old tavern gossip were a good start, a foundation of cold facts and wild guesses. But for me, the story of Eldoria was never just a collection of documents. It was a living thing, a puzzle with a heart that had stopped beating. I spent years after I first heard the legend, not just reading, but searching. I knew the answers wouldn't be found in a book of history, but in the echoes of the people who were closest to the village, those who had seen it just before the quiet fell. My grandpa, bless his old heart, understood this. He helped me track down a name Silas Finch. He was the grandson of Mr. Finch, the postman, the man who first noticed the silence. Silas lived in a small, tidy cottage not far from the old post office route, a place that smelled of pipe tobacco and peppermint. He was a kind man, with a face full of wrinkles that looked like a map of old stories. When I told him about my fascination with Eldoria, his eyes seemed to grow distant, as if he was looking back through time. He told me his grandfather, the postman, had kept a journal. Not a fancy one, but a simple, worn leather book where he would jot down the weather, his thoughts, and the little details of his daily route. It was a diary of his life, and Eldoria had been a big part of that life. Silas went into a back room and returned with a small, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. He laid it carefully on the table. Grandpa Finch wrote in this every day. He was a man of routine. He said it helped him remember things, helped him keep his head clear. I felt a thrill run through me. This wasn't a public record. This was a private account, the unfiltered thoughts of a man who saw Eldoria with his own two eyes just before it vanished. Silas let me read it, my fingers trembling as I turned the fragile pages. The entries for the years leading up to 1923 were a chronicle of a thriving community. Weather fair, delivered 3 letters to the Theron boy. One entry read, Mrs. Fitzwilliam asked me to pass along her thanks for the flower. Read another. They were the small, everyday details that the official reports had completely missed. They painted a picture of a village full of people who were alive and well and connected to the world, however tenuously. But then, in the autumn of 1922, the entries started to change. They grew shorter, more concerned. On September 14, 1922, Mr. Finch wrote, Strange visit to Eldoria today. The wind was quiet. Not the usual quiet before a storm, but a complete stillness. The leaves on the oak tree didn't rustle. Felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air. A little odd. This was a small detail, but it was huge. The official reports never mentioned the weather or the feeling of the place. They just reported what they found. But the postman, a man of the outdoors, noticed the little things. The next entry, a week later, was even more chilling. No letters for me to collect from Eldoria. The bag was empty again. Young Thomas and Mary were sitting on the steps of the church, looking out into the valley. They didn't even wave. I called out to them, but they just stared. Their faces were blank. It gave me a terrible feeling. I hope everything is all right. This was a crucial piece of the puzzle. The children. The official reports had just mentioned the abandoned hoop, not the children themselves. They were the first ones to go quiet. They were the ones who saw something, or felt something, and it had a profound effect on them. The entries continued like this for weeks. The outgoing mail from Eldoria stopped completely. The postman noticed that the villagers he saw on his route seemed more withdrawn, less talkative. Their smiles, once so ready and warm, were replaced by a kind of distant weariness. He wrote about seeing the villagers standing in their fields, not working, but just staring out into the surrounding woods, as if waiting for something to appear from the trees. He described seeing old man Fitzwilliam, the proud farmer, sitting on his porch with a shotgun in his lap, a look of profound fear on his face. This wasn't the bustling, happy village from the official history. This was a community in the grip of a quiet, creeping terror. There were whispers of a local legend, a myth the mountain folk used to tell each other around the fire. It was a story about the Whispering Woods, a dense part of the forest that surrounded the valley. The legend said that when the woods wanted to reclaim a part of the valley, they would send out a whisper, a sound that could only be heard by the children, a promise of a new, beautiful world, a world without sorrow or hard work. The children would follow the whispers, and the adults, unable to hear the sound themselves, would be so lost in their sadness that they would simply fade away, becoming part of the quiet themselves. It was a fairy tale, a bedtime story told to frighten children into staying close to home. But in the context of Eldoria, in the context of the blank faces of Thomas and Mary, the story took on a new, terrifying meaning. The postman's final entry about Eldoria was written in a shaky hand. It was dated a few weeks before the traveling salesman's visit. I made my last stop at Eldoria today. I couldn't bear to go past it without knowing. The village was completely silent. The only sound was the river. I saw no one. I walked through the square, and I felt a profound cold, even though the sun was shining. I saw a child's hoop lying in the road, broken. It made my heart ache. I saw Mrs. Henderson's shawl on the chair, a half-knitted sweater still with the needles in it. A basket of fresh eggs was still on her table. I can't explain it, but it feels as if they were never there at all. I don't think I'll be going back. This journal entry, this fragile, brittle account, gave me a new perspective. The villagers hadn't vanished in an instant. They had been in the process of vanishing for weeks, maybe even months. The silence that the postman noticed, the strange behavior of the children, the fear on the face of the proud farmer, it all pointed to a long, slow, quiet descent into oblivion. The vanishing wasn't a bang. It was a whisper. The Eldoria people were slowly being erased, not by violence or a terrible plague, but by something more insidious, something that started with a feeling of unease and ended with a complete and total silence. And I felt, as I finished the last page of the journal, that the answer to the mystery wasn't in the empty houses and the abandoned belongings. It was in the story of the Whispering Woods, a story that felt a little less like a fairy tale and a little more like a terrible truth. The map in Marcus Thorne's journal was a lifeline, a thin red line scrawled on a century-old piece of paper that led us deeper into the heart of the asylum's terrible secret. After we had read the final, desperate words of his plea, there was no turning back. We had a mission, a duty to the 53 patients whose names were now etched into our memories. We had to find the chambers of silence. The red-inked path led from the library to a small, heavy stone door, almost completely hidden behind a large, rotting wooden bookshelf. The door was held shut by a simple iron latch, which, with a rusty groan, gave way to a gentle push. Behind it was another passage, even narrower and darker than the one that led to the library. The air was a suffocating mix of cold, damp earth and the heavy smell of stale air that had been trapped for 100 years. We held our flashlights out in front of us, the beams a weak, flickering light against the profound blackness. Marcus Thorne's journal had been our guide to the first passage, and now it was our guide to the second. He had called this one the Passage of Dread, and I could see why. The walls were wet with condensation, and the low ceiling was dripping with water, creating a rhythmic, chilling plinking sound in the distance. The floor was uneven, a mix of mud and ancient, crumbling stones. We had to move slowly, carefully, our hands tracing the cold, damp walls, our feet searching for solid ground. The passage descended deeper into the earth, the temperature dropping with every step, and the light from the outside world became a memory. We followed the path for what felt like an eternity, the passage twisting and turning, taking us deeper and deeper into the asylum's foundation, a place where no one was ever meant to go. Marcus Thorne had drawn every detail, every turn, every dip in the passage, and his meticulous, insane genius was a guiding light in the suffocating darkness. He wrote about a series of small, narrow alcoves, each with a small carving of a bird or a flower, a tiny, defiant act of beauty in a place of profound ugliness. We found them as we went, our flashlights illuminating the small, beautiful details, the last whispers of a man who saw the beauty in the darkness. Finally, after what felt like an age, the passage opened up into a wider space. The air here was drier, the walls were less wet, and the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of an empty building, it was the silence of a tomb. We were in a small, square chamber, a kind of antechamber, and in front of us, there was a heavy iron door, its surface covered in a thick layer of rust. The door was heavy and solid, a final barrier to a place that no one was ever meant to find. My grandpa and I worked together, putting our combined weight against the door. With a terrible, grinding groan, the door gave way, its rusted hinges protesting loudly against the 100 years of stillness. The air that rushed out was cold and still, with a profound, almost spiritual emptiness. We stepped inside, our flashlights sweeping across a long, narrow hallway, lined with a series of heavy iron doors, all of them slightly ajar, all of them leading to a small, dark cell. This was it. This was the Chambers of Silence, the final destination of Dr. Finch's dark experiment. The cells themselves were small, just big enough for a single cot. The walls were covered in a thick, sound-dampening material, and the doors had no windows, no light, no way for sound to get in or out. They were tombs for the living, a place of complete and total sensory deprivation. But the most chilling thing was not the cells themselves, but the things we found inside. Each cell was empty, of course, but it wasn't a complete emptiness. In one cell, on the floor, we found a small, hand-carved wooden bird, the same kind of bird I had seen in the old photograph. In another, a small piece of a child's toy, a tiny, wooden wheel. In another, a small, faded drawing of a flower, etched into the sound-dampening wall. These weren't just objects, they were the last vestiges of a life, the final, desperate whispers of a person who was trying to hold on to something, to some part of their humanity, in a place of total darkness and silence. They were the stories of the 53 patients, told not in words, but in the small, fragile things they had left behind. They were the ghosts of Elmwood Asylum, and they were not a myth. They were real people, with real lives, and they had been erased, not by a ghost or a devil, but by a man who believed he was doing good. The silence I had felt on Elmwood Hill was not the silence of an empty building. It was the silence of forgotten lives, of a truth that had been locked away for 100 years, waiting for someone like me to find it. My grandpa and I stood there for a long time, just looking, not speaking. The silence was profound, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the echoes of songs about summer fields, the stories of hand-carved birds, and the whispers of a man who had seen the truth and tried to leave a record. We had found the Chambers of Silence, and we had found the truth. But our journey wasn't over. We had found the truth, but now we had to do something with it. We had to tell the world, to give the 53 patients back their names, to make sure their story was never forgotten again. The secret of Elmwood Asylum was not just a historical mystery, it was a human tragedy, and it was a story that needed to be told, not in whispers, but in a loud, clear voice that could be heard by everyone. The silence in the chambers was no longer just silence, it was a weight, a heavy blanket of forgotten lives. We stood there for a long time, the words from Marcus Thorne's journal echoing in our minds. The hand-carved bird, the toy wheel, the faded drawing, they were all a testament to a terrible, quiet tragedy that had been locked away for a century. My grandpa, his face grim and pale in the flickering light of our flashlights, finally broke the silence. "We can't just leave this here," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "This is not just a discovery, Leo. This is a responsibility." He was right. We had found the truth, but what we did with it was just as important. The drive back down Elmwood Hill was a different kind of journey. The world outside, the one we had left behind just a few hours ago, seemed different now, brighter, more alive, a stark contrast to the darkness we had just left. We didn't talk much on the way home. The air in the car was thick with unspoken thoughts, the weight of the journal in the back seat a physical presence. We were no longer just a boy and his grandpa on a weekend adventure, we were keepers of a secret, witnesses to a terrible truth that had been buried for 100 years. That night, in the quiet of my grandpa's study, we laid out the journal and the list of names. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the words were as sharp and clear as if they had been written yesterday. We reread Marcus Thorne's words, the story of Dr. Finch's twisted project, the list of the 53 patients. My grandpa, a man who had dedicated his life to uncovering the past, had a look of profound sadness in his eyes. He said, "They weren't just patients, Leo. They were people. They had families, lives, stories. And now, thanks to Marcus Thorne, we have their names. It's our job to find those stories, to give them back to the world." That's when our real work began. The mystery wasn't about finding out what happened anymore, it was about honoring the memory of the people who were lost. We spent the next several months in the musty, quiet archives of the local historical society, surrounded by endless stacks of old newspapers, census records, and town ledgers. We were searching for ghosts, but not the kind that haunt old houses. We were searching for the ghosts of the 53, the names from Marcus Thorne's list. We started with a name that had always stuck with me from the journal, Eleanor, age 42, always humming a song about a summer field. We found her in an old census record from 1930. Her full name was Eleanor Vance, and she was listed as a domestic worker. She had no family in the area, no living relatives listed in the town records. But then, in a box of old, forgotten photographs, we found a small, faded picture of a young woman with a kind face and a gentle smile, her hair a cascade of curls, her eyes full of a quiet grace. On the back, in a careful, spidery hand, the words Eleanor Vance, 1928 were written. She was a real person, a woman with a life, a story. The thought of her, a living, breathing woman, humming a song about a summer field in the cold, silent walls of Elmwood, made my heart ache. Then there was Thomas, age 21, loved to carve small birds out of wood. We found him in the town's birth records. He was the son of a local carpenter, and a few old newspaper articles mentioned his talent for carving. He had won a local award for a beautiful wooden bird he had carved as a teenager, a bird so lifelike it seemed ready to take flight. The articles spoke of his family's pride, of their hope for his future. But then, the articles stopped. There was no mention of his entry into Elmwood, no mention of his family's sorrow. He just disappeared from the records, erased from the public consciousness, just as Dr. Finch had intended. The small, hand-carved bird we found in the chambers wasn't just a toy, it was a final, poignant piece of his life, a last, beautiful memory left behind in a place of profound ugliness. We found others, too. Mary, age 35, who always asking for a pen and paper to write letters to a family she no longer had. We found her name in the records of a nearby town. She was a schoolteacher, a bright, cheerful woman who had suffered a devastating loss and had been institutionalized for her grief. She had a sister who had moved away, a sister who, according to a small, handwritten note in a dusty old ledger, had never stopped writing her letters, letters that never made it to Elmwood, letters that were probably still sitting in a box somewhere, waiting to be read. The work was slow and painstaking, a methodical process of piecing together the fragmented lives of 53 people from dusty old records and faded photographs. We weren't just uncovering a historical mystery anymore, we were giving a voice to the voiceless, a story to the forgotten. The horror of Elmwood Asylum was not in the chaos of a mass disappearance, but in the quiet, systematic erasure of human lives. Dr. Finch had a plan to silence them, to make them disappear without a trace. But he hadn't counted on a boy and his grandpa, a few old journals, and a century of quiet secrets waiting to be found. The story of the 53 patients wasn't over. It was just beginning, and we were going to make sure it was a story that everyone would remember, a story that would forever shine a light on the dark secrets of Elmwood Asylum.